Hiya, I'm Jane, I'm your host. I'm beginning today at a place that might make you feel a bit like, wait the now, why are we diving in here? Let me start with sharing on spiritual ego, but not in the way that you might have heard this term before. If you're like me, you are likely to be a bit averse to saturated spiritual terms generally anyway. What I've come to learn is that most people talk about ego like it's something to remove, something to get rid of, some kind of flaw that's holding us back from enlightenment, in inverted commas. A whole episode could be dedicated to that term alone, right? Enlightenment. And I used to think some of that myself, quite honestly. But spiritual ego and spirituality are different. Spiritual ego seeks to transcend the human experience. Spirituality, irrespective of the flavour, let's call it that, supports us in how to fully inhabit it. And here's what I've learned. The problem, as we're going to go on to explore today, isn't ego. In fact, ego, I've found, is necessary for an accurate sense of self. The problem is when spiritual ego masquerades itself as spirituality. And amongst other ways, I've found that spiritual ego shows up when we start believing there's a right way to be or to do something. And once we believe that, once we accept that and perpetuate that, that there's a right way, we're already making a choice about who gets to decide what's right or wrong. We're outsourcing our authority. We're stepping away from what we actually know to be true, how we actually feel, the truth of our own power. And that's the cascade, that's the trap. I lived in that trap personally for many years. And today, what I fell into was unpacking with you 3 specific ways that this shows up in our life and in our energy work. Not to call anybody out. In fact, I've actively contributed to all of what I'm highlighting in this episode today. Got a wee list of notes there that I just sat and took for you. So this isn't a bashing session. Rather, once we see it, we can't unsee it. And once we can't unsee it, we get to choose something different. So let's dive in. One of the most common ways I've found that spiritual ego shows up in the people I work with, in the communities I've sat in previously, and the beliefs that I've held myself is through the idea that there's a right way to be spiritual. And how I see that show up in the context of today's episode, like I mentioned before, is in 3 places: what we consume, how we look, and how we practice unique energy work. So I want to share on my experience with what we consume, because this one for me is everywhere, particularly within the Reiki industry. The belief tends to be in certain spiritual learning spaces, or more generally, particularly, again, prevalent with Reiki, you should eat certain things, avoid certain things, drink certain things, not drink certain things. I see this most consistently coming up with a 21-day Reiki cleanse. If you've been through mainstream Reiki training, you're probably going to know what I'm talking about here. You got attuned at level 1, and alongside that attunement, you are given a list normally. Doesn't happen all the time, but most of the time. Multiple, what can be often significant changes suggested to be made all at once. The 21-day cleanse can look like stop eating meat, don't drink alcohol, get out into nature every day, do this for 21 days, and it'll help you develop a better connection with Reiki. It's presented as essential. Like this cleanse is the thing that's going to unlock our ability to work with the energy. I don't want to digress into why that's energetically speaking inaccurate. Let's cover that another day, but let's bring it back in for just now. And I want to be really clear, I don't subscribe to levels or attunements, and I definitely don't subscribe to a 21-day cleanse. Not because there's anything wrong with eating differently or spending time in nature, of course there's not, but because the structure of that cleanse works against our brain's natural ability to support change, scientifically speaking. It causes overwhelm. You're trying to make multiple significant changes at once. You're white knuckling it for 21 days, and then what? The 21 days end and you go back to how you were. Apply this to wherever you're at in your life, wanting to get to the gym or meditate more, or different from meditation, learn how to spirit-led Reiki journey, read more books, whatever it is for you. Normally, initially, We don't just pick one. We decide to overhaul. It's a cultural thing, and it isn't supported by the brain. It's not how change actually works. Here's what I see happening, and I have been this happening personally. The majority of people who come into my world after having done mainstream training, they feel like a failure. They couldn't stick to the cleanse when they talk about it. They had a glass of wine on day 4, they ate meat on day 6. They didn't make it out into nature every day. I did exactly the same thing. I also admitted to people at a spiritual class that I went to at the time. And rather than a me too, there were just simply gasps, adding to the fact that I felt like I was alone in this perceived failing. Now, little did I know that years later I would then form a community of hundreds of people sharing honestly about these types of experiences. So, as it transpired, I indeed wasn't the only one. And most often, that perceived failing is internalized as I'm not disciplined enough, I'm not serious enough, I'm not committed to my practice enough, I'm not good enough. When actually, what happened is people were given an unrealistic prescription that was never designed to support humans to thrive. It's very National Health Service, isn't it? Top line interventions: stop the drinking, stop the eating, address the behaviour at the surface level, and hope the person has enough willpower to stick with it. And when they don't stick with it, the shame lands on them, not the system that's actively set them up for a failure. I've been there. But what I actually believe is we don't address change at surface level. We address it below the surface level. We look at the why and not the what. There's never any mention, for example, in a 21-day cleanse of just saying no, of recognising when something doesn't feel good, doesn't feel aligned, when you've taken responsibility for something that was never yours to carry and decide to just stop doing that and act in accordance, say no. For me personally, that was the actual work, just that one thing. And you know what happened when I did that work, just in this one area of saying no, a huge chunk of my personal power came back, a huge chunk of my energy came back. I felt like an entirely different person. That one saying no change started to reshape my relationship with alcohol. Eventually, I stopped drinking alcohol altogether. I quit smoking, I stopped binge eating. The only addiction, you might have heard me say before, I've not had is coffee. And I've tried to like coffee many times. And this isn't because I'm puritanical. And quite frankly, I think that we have a terrible rhetoric often in the spiritual world where these things are deemed as bad. So those who could genuinely benefit from support within the industry are afraid to enter it or say what's actually going on for them through fear of being judged. Now, for me, I didn't try to do the quitting or the white knuckling through the 21-day cleanse. I just worked at squaring my stuff out, and it was all rooted in spirit-led animistic skills. And I don't do ideas of grandeur or quick fixes, but equally, I can't not share the truth. That is how I did it. I addressed the why, and the what shifted naturally. It was just a natural byproduct. It's a main reason why there's the root element in the pathway, reclaiming spiritual authority. That's what reclaiming authority looks like in reality. The eat this or don't eat that approach, particularly when it's highlighted in something like a 21-day cleanse, in my experience, it just sets people up to feel rubbish about themselves on top of what they are already carrying. And we carry a lot, particularly in our society, in my experience. It's like putting a plaster on a gaping wound and then serving up a side of, here, let me drown your self-worth just a little bit further as well. And it's completely unnecessary when people can't stick to it. And most often, understandably, people cannot stick to it. They feel horrible. They feel like they're failing at spirituality or Reiki or energy work or just generally as a human, like something's fundamentally wrong with how they're approaching this. In my own personal experience, and from having spoke to hundreds of practitioners on this very topic, when actually the only thing that's wrong is they were given a framework that doesn't work, a framework that addresses the surface whilst ignoring everything underneath, a framework that requires the willpower instead of wisdom, discipline instead of discernment. And when that willpower or discipline runs out, which it always does, the shame just moves in more and more. Willpower, discipline, other words that we could explore in itself another day, right? And that's how spiritual ego spiritual ego, gets tangled up with this. Because the cleanse comes with the implicit message there's a right way, and if you're not doing it, you're wrong. And if you're wrong, you're certainly not doing it right. So the framework perpetuates until people say, no, I'm not doing this again. I'm not buying into this. Or I'm not mentoring this, despite the structure of the system saying that I need to. The system creates it, but the ego keeps it alive. And here's another one. It's quite sneaky. And again, everywhere I've found, there's this thing that I've noticed happens quite often when we're exploring spirituality. I saw it in myself, and I support others in reclaiming after rejecting it. Because we can't just reject, right? We've got to reclaim in the gap that the rejection leaves. So we're looking for teachers, mentors, guides, people that can somehow genuinely support us. And here's what I've found we do often, not always. We use their appearance as evidence that they know something. Now, I want to pause here and say, you might be like, I don't do that. Now, we judge people all the time. It's a lens we will not ever, as human beings, eradicate. In some part, it can actually help to keep us safe, but knowing when it's flavouring how we navigate life, I've found to be key. Understanding the lens, not letting the lens dominate. Yeah. So there can be some common ones I've noticed. The ethereal one, often quite polished and mystical. The one draped in flowery fabrics, wearing crystals, tossing flower petals in a cornfield, or van life, the shamanic type. We see the aesthetic and we think, that's what spiritual looks like. That's what I'm craving. I want to become that. And then we revert back to how we've tried to become that our whole life from childhood. We took two paths normally, I find people have taken in childhood. One, and it's normally the path that most people take, which is try really hard to fit in. Don't differentiate, be part of the homogenization. Or two, have a really tough time of it as a misfit, particularly in ways I've come to learn around mental health is normally what's most impacted there. If the misfit route is what we took growing up. I've tried to be every single one of those versions, by the way, on the search to feel belonging. What I was actually doing, I was using appearance to convince people, myself predominantly, to begin with anyway, that I knew what I was doing way back then when I was fresh into the industry, going to classes, considering further learning. But this isn't just a fresh into the industry thing. You might resonate with what I'm saying, and you potentially have been in and around the spiritual industry for 10, 15 years. And I want to be really clear here because I believe this has got nuance, as does 99% of what I bring to the table in my podcasts. I do throw flower petals. I make flower petal offerings to the spirit of the land or whatever energies and entities I've been working with personally and professionally. I do wear flowery things sometimes. I'm a shamanic person, so I typically spend a lot of time dirty and in nature and travelling. Like I live in a small wooden hut in the middle of the forest, you know? For me, there's nothing wrong with loving an aesthetic that genuinely feels right for me. The problem I've found isn't the aesthetic itself. The problem is when the aesthetic becomes the evidence of legitimacy. What I'm observing now, especially online, is the aesthetic can create comparison. Authentic doesn't look like anything. Authentic doesn't look like anything, but it feels like something. And I'm asked about authenticity fairly frequently. Feeling authentic only continues to unfold. Feeling authentic is what happens when we're not performing. And you might be like, yeah, Jane, I don't feel like I perform. Take a step back. To some extent, even in minor areas of our lives, you may find that you, like me, like everyone else, perform, right? Until we become aware that we're doing it and then we don't do it. And all I've found is that the more I become aware of it, the more I keep unfolding different parts of it that I can then go and work on. Now, I will say this online, I believe, from my experience, you can let me know what you think, is becoming a much more authentic place. If the authenticity online, I see getting a bad rap just now because of the rise of AI, but not from where I stand. People, I notice, are using their discernment more. There's less of the curated perfection and more of the real, and more people being able to, certainly within my world, being able to distinguish between the curated and the real. And that's actually beautiful. Beautiful. I've seen it more and more, especially this year. When we're trying to reclaim, when we're working on reclaiming who we are, which is directly linked to our authentic expression of energy work, beneath all the things we've been told we should be or how we should do it, that's not the time to adopt another uniform, I don't think. Here's where it can get complicated, though, I've found, because for a lot of people like me, maybe for you as well, you might resonate. Authenticity looked like authenticity before, but it doesn't anymore. Now it needs to feel authentic. What you thought was authentic when scanning a room or scanning social media or choosing which community to sit in or which mentor to work with or which friends you want to spend time with is different now than before. So maybe you're looking at that and maybe you're like, well, I'm not sure if I can trust myself. So that's the beauty of working underneath the surface level that I spoke about before, because that's the reclamation of that self-trust. And that's where the discernment comes in. I actually spoke to discernment in Undiluted. It's my no-cost weekly email roundup. It lands on a Tuesday. The link's in the podcast notes for you if you want to come in and join us. We've been talking about the 21 cleanse just before, right? And one of the things that often comes with that cleanse, often embedded in mainstream Reiki principles, is something like, just for today, I will not anger. And on the surface, that sounds beautiful, spiritual, evolved. But what it actually does in practice, I'm not talking about, oh, that's my Diet Cola bottle on the floor. That's right. We'll digress for a moment. Maybe I have or haven't told you about the time where. Now, how apt for this episode, of course, timing. My Reiki master told me that I wasn't able to be spiritual if I drank Diet Cola. That's a fact. So, I mean, we get into ridiculous level territory here. Perhaps you've experienced that level or not. It'll be different for everybody. Getting back to what we were talking about, suppressing anger, because it all links in. What it actually does in practice, as opposed to theory, in my experience, is it teaches us to suppress our anger. You might feel similarly. Now, again, nuance here, because this principle, if we take a step back and if you've ever explored Buddhism, my good friend Gen Tubchen, she's a Kadampa Buddhist monk nun, would be likely to say, we do not anger, but Buddhism comes with the receipts on how to actually achieve that without suppression via meditation. And not your meditation that you'll find in the holistic world, the meditation that you'll find that the monks do. They're different from personal experience. With the Reiki principles, often, just for today, I will not anger specifically. It's kind of teaching us, right? Well, it's not kind of teaching us. It is teaching us that anger isn't spiritual. The anger is something to, like I said before, when we were talking to ego, transcend, something to move past. And that's toxic positivity. It's bypassing. That's putting a happy face on everything and pretending the hard stuff doesn't exist. We're not inhibiting the human life, because anger is real. Anger is valid. Anger is the mask behind which real change lies. That's the principle, if you subscribe to Reiki principles, that I always recommend that folks in my community use. Anger is the mask behind which real change lies. When we suppress anger in the name of trying to be spiritual, we're not becoming spiritual. It's almost like becoming more compliant. And here's how this connects to how we look. The aesthetic of the spiritual person often includes some kind of emotional suppression. The serene face, the calm demeanour, the person who's always at peace, always centred, always good vibes only. For me, that's not authenticity, that's performance. And it's a performance that requires whoever it may be to deny a huge part of their humanity. I've been that person. Again, nuance. There will be folks who are serene, calm. The aim for me is always regulated and not calm, however. We can be calm and not regulated, regulated and not calm. For example, that's not what I'm speaking to here. I'm speaking to facade. And often it's not meant, I've found. It's just simply because a person's never rooted their direct spiritual authority. And that's where it starts to become really tricky. And that's where people start reaching out to me and saying, hey, I've had all these experiences within my mainstream Reiki training. Sometimes it's more widely spread within other energy work training, other holistic training, within the spirituality, generally speaking, sitting within communities online and things like that, saying, is this correct? Like, is this how it works? Should this be happening? So there's three things going on here, right? There's the intentional curation of authority, looking a certain way so people believe that you know something. You might see this a lot online when you look out the way. The judgment of others based on looks, deciding who's legitimate and who isn't, based on their aesthetic. That's about the lens, isn't it? Understanding we all have a lens, but not letting that impact our reality and our choices, being radically self responsible. And then there's the pressure to perform, feeling like you've got to look a certain way to belong in whatever it might be, whatever spiritual and holistic community or learning environment, whatever it might be for you that you're in. You see how they all feed each other, and it all happens at the same time. And I've found that when we're in the early stages of our own exploration, or sometimes even way further in, when we're trying to figure out who we are, because that is ever ongoing, right? Like I said before, meeting ourselves as who we are in evolution, always ongoing. When we're trying to reclaim ourselves from all the ways that we've been told to be, that pressure can feel real. That comparison can feel real. That feeling of not spiritual enough, whether it be in relation to, there are so many. I've picked out the consuming and the 21-day cleanse and the way that we look. That it's really real. It's also the opposite of what I found I actually need. Maybe you feel similarly. And this all very much links into energy work, into how we live, lead, and serve from the power of our own truth. Because for me, this is where it gets super interesting. And this is where the right way trap becomes most visible, I feel. You might have heard the rhetoric, the narrative. There is no right way to do your energy work. There's only your way. You might even perpetuate it. I did. I used to when I was a mainstream Reiki bastard. Now, stay with me on this. It sounds beautiful. It sounds like freedom. Here's what's actually happening, I've learned. In Western energy work culture, the sacred triangle has become shattered. When we're in a learning environment, theory is elevated above everything else. Intuition becomes something we tend to develop in isolation, unsupported. Spiritual wisdom is only valid when it's confirmed by someone perceived as more advanced, gatekeeping that direct connection. And this fragmentation means that the moment you question anything about your energy work, how do I, can I, should I, you've got nowhere internal to turn to that's reliable, that's trustworthy, that you have confidence in. And then you're forced to look outside yourself for the answers. And when you outsource your answers, you outsource your power. Mainstream means learning methods and protocols that are true to someone else's culture, like Usubi Reiki as an example, Japanese. So the foundations of what we learn isn't rooted in direct, unmediated spiritual connection that's safe and that's ethical. It doesn't inherently align with our own animistic, cultural, and ancestral roots as a Western person. So the option there is to lean into our intuition, to whatever it might be you're seeking within your energy work in your life, deepen connection, deviate away from symbols, hand positions, chakras, ways of working that don't feel quite right. It's often why energy workers feel that their knowing's fragmented across a dozen half answers with no single framework, honouring the truth of how they're actually called to practice or teach authentically, ethically, powerfully. But we're still operating from within that inherited system, the lineage that isn't Western. So, especially when you're intuitive, you're going to feel that. You're going to be thinking, why can't I? Whatever it is, create my own training pathway that feels like me, understand spiritual insights, merge modalities, feel more connected, live the life that I really am craving living. Whilst all the time, what's peddled is there is no right way, only your way. How do you develop your own way within a system that is innately misaligned, that is actively set up to prohibit the deepest, truest version of your own way emerging? The answer is you can't. It's not possible. You might have heard me say before. Those in my close circle will say, If you want to know how to do anything the wrong way, ask Jane, she'll have tried it. Yeah. In my experience, it's just not possible. The missing piece, what I searched for years, direct spirit led connection. So when practitioners are told, learn this system, but then find your own way, but also respect the lineage, but also trust your intuition, there's never any mention of spiritual connection, really, is there, ever? Aside from that, what's being said is there is a right way, and here it is. Now figure out how to make that work for you, even though it might not be congruent with who you actually are. Develop your intuition, but you're only going to be able to do that in ways that don't contradict the method, because you have no tangible way to most fully trust that, and to most fully trust that intuition inside a system that's been borrowed from another culture. Honour the lineage that fundamentally means you cannot honour your own roots. Now, many of my graduates take what they are guided to take from their mainstream learning, and it comes through and it's woven into spirit led. I'm not dissing mainstream Reiki in any way, shape, or form, but what I am saying is, if you're the sort of person that wants to live, lead, and serve from the power of your own truth, you're craving that, like I very much was. It's literally like square peg round hole. For many years, I kept circling that drain of self doubt, feeling like I was the problem. Yeah. Feeling like you're doing it wrong, in my experience, highlights that you're moving towards doing it your right way. You're rejecting something, maybe the methods, the protocols. Maybe you've been told how energy work is supposed to look or what you're supposed to charge. And honestly, you've probably been rejecting lots of things in many different ways in energy work and your life as well, maybe for a short period of time, maybe for longer. Rejection is honest. It means that we're paying attention. The tide is moving. But rejection alone, in my experience, isn't enough. When we reject, we've got to reclaim something in its place. We've got to weave that sacred triangle back together. And that's what it means to do it your right way, tangibly, practically, where it's not just words that leave any of us questioning, how do I do it my way? I've found that's what reclamation actually looks like. I really look forward to catching up with you again next episode.